Welcome Primary 5. We will study now lesson 1 from unit 1. This lesson is the friction force. But at first we must know the objectives of this lesson. By the end of this lesson we must but we should be able to identify the concept of friction force. Number 2, conclude the friction force depends on the types of materials of the two surfaces. Recognize the types of friction force and explain the disadvantages of friction. And list some ways to decrease the friction force. Now we will show a simple video to explain the friction force easily. You must look at this video carefully. Look at this ball that roll on the garden. We found that this ball stopped easily. And look at this bicycle. We found the boy when he stopped pedaling. When he stopped pedaling, and look at this toy car. We found it stopped. Look at this picture carefully. We found the ball that rolled on the garden and the bicycle that ride on the smooth surface. We found the ball move a short distance, but the bicycle move for a longer distance. This is because the friction force that between the ball and the garden is bigger than the friction force that found between the road and the bicycle. And we found the force, that's friction force, is found in the opposite direction of the movement. The force always opposes the motion and is described as a force of friction. Look at this book that put on a table. We found the force of friction can be defined as the opposing force which is called into play when a body actually moves or tends to move over the surface of another body. Look at this block. Try to roll on it by using a spring balance, but we pull it for a short distance or we move it by a small force. We found the block doesn't move. But by increasing the force, we found the block will move. This is because the friction force in case number 1 is bigger than the friction force in case number 2. And now we will describe it the friction force, and we will make a small activity to know the concept of friction force. Try to throw a coin and a paper and a paper, and we will find that the coin will reaches the Earth's surface easily. This is because the friction force that found between the coin and the air is smaller than or bigger than the friction force that found between the paper and the air. Now we will make another activity. Try to roll on a ball. Try to roll on a ball. Try to roll on a ball on a rough surfaces like garden, and try to roll on this ball on a smooth surface like ceramic. What we will find, or what we will observe? We will observe that the ball will move for a longer distance in case on smooth surface. This is because the friction force that found between the ball and the road or the smooth surface is smaller than the friction force that found between the garden and the ball. So we will conclude that the friction force is the force that found between two surfaces and has its effect in the opposite direction of the object's movement, or it is a force that slows down the moving object. Look at this figure carefully that show the friction force or the direction of friction force. We will find that the direction of motion is in the opposite direction of the friction force. So it slows down the movement of objects. And look at this figure. We found that the bicycle move forward, but there are friction force found between the tires of the bike and the road. So it prevents slipping down of bicycle. So we can find that the force acting on the road by the bicycle is in the opposite direction of the movement of the bicycle. Look at these notes and we can find that a car moves forward because there is friction force between the tires and the ground. And by increasing the speed or even a change of the car's direction, the car movement needs friction. So the friction force controls the car speed. And we can walk due to the friction force between our shoes and the ground. So we can conclude that the friction force is very important for us. This is because it prevents slipping down us at walking on the ground. And we found that without friction force, you will slip down and can't walk. Note, the friction force between two surfaces is bigger on stopping than moving. To prove that, we can make an activity by bringing a smooth wooden board and some box and a cube of plastic. If we put two boxes above each others and we can put a smooth wooden board and put a cube of plastic on it, we found that the cube of plastic can't move. But by increasing the number of books, we found the cube of plastic will move. This is because by increasing the slope of the wooden board, the friction force between the cube and the wooden board decreases. So the cube slides down. But By decreasing the slope, the friction force between the cube and the wooden board increase, so the cube doesn't slide down. From that we found that there are types of surfaces that decrease the friction force and increase the friction force. On a rough surfaces as dry cement, the friction force increase. Example between rubber ball and dry cement, as if we roll on a ball on dry cement, it will move for a shorter distance than if we roll on it on a smooth surfaces like glass or with cement. We will find it will move for a longer distance. This is because the friction force decrease. For example, between glass and glass, or between rubber ball and with cement or ceramic. Look at this figure carefully. We found in case A, the boy sleeping down on a snow, and in case number B, the boy can't sleeping down on a garden. This is because garden is a rough surface, so the friction force between the garden and the boy is very big, but the friction force between the boy and the snow is smaller than case B, so he will sleeping down in case A for a longer distance than B. But we found that the friction force has a big disadvantages. This is because the friction force or its direction is always against the force that causes the movement. So the internal moving parts of machines are often damaged. This is because the friction causes a rise in temperature of these parts, and if the temperature rises up more than a certain limit, the machine or the internal moving parts of machine are often damaged. But there are ways of decreasing the friction force. These ways by using lubricants and oil that form a thin layer between the two surfaces of machine, or by using a ball bearing which are made from a group of small metallic balls that have smooth surfaces to put between the surfaces of internal moving parts of machines. We found that these ball bearings are used, for example, as the axis that transmits the motion from the car engine into the wheels. Now we will show a video to explain friction force easily, and look at this video carefully. We found that the friction force is in the opposite direction of the movement. Look at this picture. Look at this picture carefully. We found that the boy can't push this cube easily. This is because the friction force that found between the ground and the box that prevent the pushing of this box easily. And we will show another video. Look at this cow that try to eat a grass, but if there is no friction force between its legs and the ground, it will slip down, so it can't eat easily. Look. if there is no friction force. It will slip down. So, the friction force is very important to prevent slipping down. Now, we will answer some questions to understand the friction force. Put right or wrong. Put right or wrong. Number one, the friction force is always in the same direction of the object's movement. This question, right or wrong, is always in the same direction. Of course, wrong. This is because the friction force is in the opposite direction. Number two, the friction force between two surfaces is greater on moving than stopping. Is greater on moving than stopping. Right or wrong? Of course, wrong. This is because the friction force between two surfaces is smaller. Is smaller on moving than stopping. This is because the friction force between any two touching surfaces in case stopping is very, very big. But in case moving, this means that the friction force is very small. Try to answer these questions. Write the scientific terms. A force that slows down the moving object and has its effect in the opposite direction of the movement. What is the scientific term of this word? Try to answer. A force that slows down the moving object and has its effect in the opposite direction. Right, it's the friction force. Another example. Complete the following sentences. Number one, space is used to decrease the effect of friction force between the internal moving parts of machine. What can we use to decrease the effect of friction force? Try to answer. Right. Oils or ball bearing or lubricants. Number two, friction force has its effect on the space direction of the object's movement. On the same direction or opposite direction? Try to answer. Right. Opposite. Number three, the force that slows down the object's motion is called. What's the concept of this force that slows down the object's movement? It's called friction force. Excellent. Study well this lesson primary 5 and thanks.